At around 4 in the morning, a brother and sister walk into a home that looks wrong in a very particular way. Drawers are pulled open. The place appears ransacked, but there's no clear sign that anyone forced their way inside. They move through the darkness toward the upstairs bedroom, and within minutes, the story they tell the police will become the story the whole country hears. A break-in, a robbery, a senseless double murder in a wealthy neighborhood of São Paulo. But investigators will quietly notice something else at the same time. The scene doesn't just look staged. It feels staged, and the person you'd expect to be the most shattered is, by multiple accounts, strangely composed. Before the sun rises, the case is already splitting into two versions of reality. One version is what's being said out loud. The other is what the evidence will begin to say, piece by piece, over the coming days. This is the case of Manfred and Marísia von Richthofen. And it's not just the story of a brutal crime. It's the story of how privilege can become a mask, how a relationship can become a pressure chamber, and how a single ordinary detail can pull an entire lie apart. If you're here for careful, long-form investigations that don't sensationalize tragedy, consider subscribing now, and stay with me until the end. Because we're going to follow the thread that truly cracked this case, an unexpected purchase that raised a quiet alarm, and then we'll fast forward to what happened years later, when the person convicted of orchestrating this crime was released into the world again. Before we go further, one quick clarity anchor. Some parts of this case are confirmed through court findings and widely reported investigative timelines. Some claims, especially around money and motives, have been alleged by prosecutors or repeated in media, and they need to be treated as claims unless they're backed by court-proven facts. I'll separate what we know from what's alleged as we go. Now rewind with me, because to understand why investigators became suspicious so quickly, you have to understand what this family looked like from the outside. In São Paulo, the Richthofens appeared to be the kind of family people point to when they talk about stability and success. Manfred was a German-Brazilian engineer with a high-level role in public infrastructure, a director at Dursa, the state company associated with São Paulo's highways. Marísia was a psychiatrist, someone trained to listen, to diagnose, to see beneath the surface of people's words. They lived in Brooklyn, a wealthy neighborhood. They had two children, Suzanne, born in 1983, and her younger brother Andreas. From the outside, it was the picture of upward mobility and comfort, elite schooling, multiple languages, and a daughter who, by her late teens, was enrolled in a law program and seemed positioned for a future of options. That's an important word here, options, because one of the enduring questions in this case is why someone with so many choices would decide they had none. A second question is harder, but it matters if we want to keep this story grounded in reality rather than mythology. What exactly was the motive? Was it love? Was it money? Was it control? Or was it a mixture, each part amplifying the others until something unimaginable seemed, to the people planning it, almost inevitable? And that brings us to the relationship at the center of the storm. In 1999, Suzanne met Daniel Cravinhos. He came from a more modest background, and accounts describe him as a motorcycle mechanic and a young man whose lifestyle and priorities did not match what Suzanne's parents imagined for her future. Early on, the relationship existed in that tension that can feel familiar across cultures. A young adult trying to define themselves, parents trying to protect, sometimes too tightly, what they think is best. At first, the family tolerated it. Daniel even had a connection to the household through Andreas and a shared interest in model airplanes. But over time, the parents' unease grew. And in this case, the unease wasn't subtle. By mid-2002, the conflict escalated. While Manfred and Marísia traveled in Europe, Suzanne, still a teenager, invited Daniel to live in the family home in secret. Reports describe a month of freedom that, to a young couple, may have felt like a private rehearsal of adult life. Then the parents came home, discovered what was happening, and kicked Daniel out. Here's a moment where you can almost feel the fork in the road. The family conflict could have turned into distance, a breakup, a cooling-off period, therapy, boundaries, any number of human outcomes. Instead, the conflict hardened. According to case accounts, Suzanne asked her father to buy her an apartment so she and Daniel could live together. Manfred refused, insisting that if she wanted to be independent, she would have to do it without the family's financial support. That refusal becomes a key psychological hinge in many retellings of this case. Not because it caused what happened, millions of people experience family conflict without becoming violent, but because it may have shifted the story Suzanne told herself. Instead of "my parents disagree," it can become "my parents are trapping me." Instead of "I'm frustrated," it can become "they're the enemy." And once you decide someone is an obstacle rather than a person, it becomes easier to imagine removing them. If you've ever had a situation where you felt a parent's boundary crossed into control, or where you think a boundary was necessary, this is a moment to pause and reflect. What do you think this refusal meant in Suzanne's mind? A reasonable limit, or a humiliation she couldn't tolerate? Tell me your read in the comments, because people interpret this turning point in very different ways. Now, we need to be careful. It's tempting in a case like this to treat the next steps as a straight line, conflict to conspiracy to crime. Real life is usually messier than that. But in this case, investigators and later court findings describe planning over a period of time, involving Suzanne, Daniel, and Daniel's brother Christian Krivinhos. The plan in broad terms was chilling, remove the parents, stage the scene to look like a robbery, and escape suspicion long enough for grief to become a shield. There's a detail here that matters for both ethics and understanding. We do not need to describe violence in a graphic way to understand intent. What matters is the premeditation, the decisions made before the victims had any chance to defend themselves, any chance to suspect the danger within their own home. One of the first practical problems in that planning was Andreas. Andreas was younger, about 15 at the time, and he wasn't just a sibling in the house. He was a variable, a witness, a potential victim if things spiraled. According to case accounts, Suzanne arranged to get him out of the house by giving him money to spend the night at a LAN gaming center, an all-night internet cafe, so he wouldn't be home. It's a small, almost mundane detail, a teenager out late gaming. But in the context of what happened next, it becomes one of the most haunting parts of the story, because it shows the plan wasn't impulsive. It was engineered, and this is where the story becomes hard to hold in your hands, because it forces a question that has no comfortable answer. At what point did Andreas stop being a brother to protect and become simply a problem to solve? Hold on to Andreas. We'll come back to him later, because years after the crime he becomes, in many ways, the most overlooked victim of all. Now, late October 2002, the Richthofen home at night. The parents asleep upstairs, the son out of the house, and the plan moves from imagination to action. According to case accounts, the home's alarm system was disabled, and the front door was unlocked to allow Daniel and Christian inside. The brothers went upstairs to the master bedroom carrying iron bars, and Manfred and Marísia were attacked in their bed. I'm going to keep the next part clinical and minimal. The victims suffered fatal injuries. Marísia was also smothered. What matters for understanding is not the physical detail, but the context. They were asleep in their own home. The attack was not a confrontation. It was an execution carried out against defenseless people. While this happened, accounts state Suzanne remained downstairs. That detail will later become important in how the defense and prosecution argue about her role. Did she wield a weapon? No. But the question the court would focus on is whether she orchestrated the entire event, whether she was the author of the crime, even if she wasn't the one delivering blows. After the killings, the scene was staged. Drawers were opened, papers scattered. The home was made to look ransacked. Cash, around 8,000 reis, was taken from a safe. Then came the alibis. Suzanne and Daniel went to a motel, presenting themselves as a young couple spending the night together. Christian went to a fast food restaurant. The next morning, Suzanne and Daniel picked up Andreas, and together they returned to the home. This is where we return to the opening image. The staged house, the call to police around 4 a.m., and a daughter discovering the scene she already knew existed. On paper, it might have looked workable, at least to the people who planned it. In a city as large as São Paulo, robberies do happen. Violence does happen, and wealthy homes can be targets. But experienced investigators know something important. A staged crime scene often tells on itself. Not because criminals are unintelligent, but because they're trying to imitate chaos. And chaos is hard to counterfeit. Investigators reportedly noticed there was no clear sign of forced entry. The alarm system had been deactivated. Valuables were left behind. The robbery seemed selective and rushed. Then there was behavior. According to case accounts, detectives were struck by Suzanne's demeanor, calm, detached, and by reports that soon after the murders she was seen swimming as if nothing had happened. There were also reports that she went out to celebrate her birthday shortly after the funeral. Now, we need to be cautious here. Grief doesn't look one way. People can dissociate, compartmentalize, behave oddly. You cannot convict someone based on the vibes. But investigators don't use behavior as proof on its own. They use it as a compass. It tells them where to look next. So they looked at the circle closest to the victims, the daughter, the boyfriend's brother. And then, a detail arrived that was not emotional at all. It was financial. An anonymous tip pointed police toward a suspicious purchase. Christian Krivinhos bought a new motorcycle the day after the murders, paying in cash with large denomination bills. In a case that's been staged as a robbery, sudden spending is like smoke. It doesn't prove there's a fire, but it tells you where heat might be. If you were one of the detectives at this point, what would you do first? Would you focus on the crime scene inconsistencies, the missing money, the boyfriend's movements, the family dynamics? I'm genuinely curious, Leave your detective instinct in the comments. On November 8, 2002, police confronted Christian. According to case accounts, he confessed and implicated Suzanne and Daniel. The next day, November 9th, Suzanne and the Cravinhos brothers were arrested. The story that had been built for public consumption began collapsing rapidly. After her arrest, Suzanne also confessed, according to case accounts. And that's the moment Brazil was forced to look at the case differently, because a robbery is frightening, but familiar. A daughter orchestrating the murder of her own parents, inside a wealthy home, felt like a rupture in the social order. This is where the case becomes larger than 3 defendants and 2 victims. It becomes a cultural earthquake about family, class, and betrayal. But before we move forward, we should humanize the people who were lost here, because true crime can flatten victims into names on a timeline. Manfred von Richthofen wasn't just a wealthy father. He was a working engineer who held a high-responsibility job. Marísia wasn't just a mother. She was a psychiatrist, someone who spent her life trying to help other people navigate pain, fear, and instability. It's hard not to imagine, in the quiet moments of their daily life, how ordinary things were. Breakfast, work, a conversation about school, a disagreement about dating, the normal friction of a family, until it wasn't normal anymore. And it's also hard to ignore the cruel irony. Marísia, trained to read people, to detect distress, to sense hidden turmoil. Did she sense anything? Did she worry about the intensity of the conflict? Did she think, even for a second, that her own daughter could become dangerous? We don't know those private details, and we shouldn't invent them. But we can acknowledge the tragedy of it. This didn't happen in an alley. It happened in a home that should have been the safest place in their world. In the days after the arrests, the narrative of the case sharpened. Prosecutors argued that the motive was a combination of freedom and money, removing parental control and gaining access to wealth. Here's where we need to separate confirmed from alleged. Confirmed, the parents were killed, the scene was staged to resemble a burglary, and Suzanne, Daniel, and Christian were arrested and later tried and convicted for their roles. Alleged, the full scope of money involved, including claims of large sums held in a Swiss account connected to the family, has been discussed in media and sometimes attributed to prosecutorial suspicion. Treat those numbers cautiously unless you're reviewing primary documents. And then there's the most human category, unknown. What was said in private between Suzanne and her parents in those final months? What pressures existed in the relationship that never made it into court records? We may never know. What we do know is that the investigation moved quickly once the inner circle came into focus. And within a week of the murders, the alibi story had fallen apart. For the public, though, the case was just beginning. Because in Brazil, as in the United States, a crime like this becomes a mirror. People don't just watch it to learn what happened. They watch it to argue about what it means. They ask, is this about moral decay? Is it about indulgent parenting? Is it about the influence of a boyfriend? Is it about class resentment? Is it about a justice system that's either too soft or too vengeful? And as the case moved toward trial, the media attention grew into something that started to shape the story itself. It took nearly 4 years for the defendants to face trial. In June 2006, Suzanne, Daniel, and Christian went on trial in São Paulo. The charges included aggravated homicide under Brazilian law, reflecting multiple aggravating factors. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Demand to watch was so intense that seating required a lottery system. And inside, the trial became a battle over narrative, because the facts of death were not in dispute. What was in dispute was authorship and control. Suzanne's defense argued that she was manipulated, portrayed as a young woman pressured by her boyfriend, threatened with abandonment, coerced into participating. This is a familiar strategy in cases where a defendant's direct physical involvement is less obvious. Shift the moral weight onto the person who committed the physical act, and cast the planner as emotionally trapped. Daniel and Christian, on the other hand, accused Suzanne of being the mastermind. Prosecutors agreed with that framing, presenting her as someone who orchestrated the plan and used the brothers as instruments. If you've ever watched a long trial, you know the strange thing about them. They aren't just about what happened. They're about what kind of story a jury can accept as reality. So what story did the jury accept here? After lengthy deliberations, reported as about 65 hours, the verdict came on July 22, 2006. Suzanne was found guilty and sentenced to 39 years and 6 months. Daniel received the same sentence, and Christian received 38 years and 6 months. That's the legal outcome. But in the public imagination, the outcome was something else. A wealthy young woman became a symbol of betrayal so intense that, for many, it eclipsed all other details. And that's where we need to talk about something uncomfortable in true crime. Public hatred can feel like justice. It can also become a kind of entertainment. Our job, if we're going to tell these stories responsibly, is to remember that hatred doesn't resurrect the dead, and spectacle doesn't heal the living. So instead of feeding anger, let's focus on consequences, the kind that don't fit neatly into a sentence length. Suzane began serving her sentence in Tremembe, a women's penitentiary known in Brazil for housing high-profile inmates. Over the years, reports described her as keeping a low profile, studying, working prison jobs, trying to function inside a system built around routine and restriction. Meanwhile, Daniel and Christian served time as well, and the case continued to follow them as a shadow. In Brazil, sentences can be reduced through good behavior credits and progression through different custody regimes. In 2015, after about 9 years, Suzane moved from a closed regime to a semi-open regime, allowing work outside during the day while returning at night. This is often where international audiences get surprised, especially those accustomed to the American system. In Brazil, there is no death penalty, and formal life sentences are not the standard structure. The penal approach leans more toward eventual reintegration, even in notorious cases. And when the public sees someone convicted of orchestrating a double murder receiving furloughs or semi-open privileges, it triggers something primal, the feeling that the world has lost its moral balance. But the system doesn't run on feelings. It runs on statutes, credits, eligibility, and court approvals. In January 2023, a judge approved Suzane's progression to an open regime, effectively parole-like freedom, after more than 16 years behind bars. On January 11, 2023, she walked out of prison. This is a pivotal moment in the modern version of the story, because the crime happened in 2002, and for many people, it's frozen there. But release forces society to confront a harder reality. Punishment ends. Time passes, people re-enter the world, and the victims remain dead. As you listen to this next section, consider what you believe justice is supposed to accomplish. Is it supposed to balance a moral ledger? Is it supposed to protect society? Is it supposed to rehabilitate? Is it supposed to express collective outrage? Most systems claim it's some mixture. In practice, those goals can conflict. Where do you land on that? Does a progression system make sense even for notorious crimes? Or do you think some acts should permanently remove a person from public life? I'd like to hear your perspective in the comments, especially if you can explain why. Now here's a midpoint clarity anchor, because this case is emotionally heavy and it's easy to get lost in the outrage. The key proven elements are planning, staging, and involvement of multiple participants. The investigation turned quickly once spending behavior and inconsistencies pointed away from a random robbery, and the trial ended in convictions and lengthy sentences. Now this is the only time I'll say this. If you want to support careful, victim-centered reporting, a quick tap on the like button helps more than you'd think. Thank you. After release, reports say Suzane kept a low profile, spending time in a rural area and later resettling within São Paulo state. She also legally dropped von Richthofen from her name and adopted a new legal name tied to her maternal family line and her partner's surname. Reporting indicates the change was formalized in December 2023. In itself, a name change is not evidence of anything, but symbolically, it shows an awareness that the name von Richthofen has become a permanent marker in the public mind, one that can prevent employment, anonymity, and basic social participation. And that raises a question many people don't want to ask out loud. What does reintegration look like for someone the public will never forgive? Not long after, reports emerged that she had a child, born in 2024. Again, this isn't a moral argument, it's a reality argument. It shows time moving forward, life continuing, and the permanent discomfort of a society, watching someone convicted of such a crime build an ordinary-looking future. But the story doesn't end with Suzane's life outside prison. If anything, the most tragic long-term consequences may belong to the person who didn't choose any of this. Andreas lost both parents in one night. And he lost his sister, too, not physically but symbolically, because the person who had been his sibling became, in the public story, something else entirely. According to reports discussed in the case brief, Andreas struggled with trauma and mental health issues, and in 2017, he made headlines after being found wandering in a disoriented state, reportedly experiencing a psychological breakdown. Pause on that for a moment. This is what true crime can miss if it's only focused on villains and verdicts. The long tail, the years afterward, the quiet damage that doesn't make headlines until it spills into the street. If you've made it this far, I want to invite a different kind of comment, not about Suzane, but about Andreas. In stories where a family is destroyed from the inside, who do you think gets forgotten first? The victims, the surviving relatives, or the community that has to keep living next door to the memory? Your answer says a lot about what you believe accountability should include. Now, we should talk about the final unresolved cloud that hangs over this case in many discussions: money, and inheritance. Public debate has included whether Suzanne could ever benefit from her parents' estate, and how inheritance law should treat someone convicted of arranging a parent's death. This has remained a sensitive, contested topic in public conversation. Because even if someone serves a prison sentence, the idea of profiting from the crime feels, to many, like a second violation. I'm not going to pretend this issue has a simple answer. Different countries handle it differently. Even within one system, it can become complicated. Timelines, civil proceedings, and legal concepts that don't always align with moral instinct. But as a moral thought experiment, it's one of the clearest questions this case leaves behind. If the law's job is to prevent crime and punish it, should the law also block financial benefit that flows from the crime, even years later? Or is the prison sentence the entirety of punishment, and everything beyond that becomes a separate question? This is another moment where I'd like your perspective, because you can disagree in good faith. What should happen to inheritance rights in a case like this? Should they be automatically removed, or decided case by case? Leave your reasoning, not just your conclusion. Now let's pull back and look at why this case continues to resurface in Brazilian culture. In the years after the murders, the Richthofen home reportedly became a kind of landmark, graffiti, curiosity, a physical site where people projected shock and fascination. Stories like this don't stay in courtrooms. They migrate into movies, series, and public mythology. In 2025, Prime Video released a series titled Trememb, a dramatized portrayal set inside the prison environment associated with high-profile inmates, including a character based on Suzanne. Dramatizations can bring attention, but they can also blur the line between fact and narrative, especially for viewers encountering the case for the first time. So here's another clarity anchor. The most ethical way to engage with dramatizations is to treat them as interpretations, not evidence. They may use true elements, but they are built for storytelling, not for establishing a record. And that brings us to the heart of why we tell true crime stories at all. Not to cosplay detectives, not to romanticize criminals, and not to turn victims into props for suspense. We tell them because they reveal something about human behavior under pressure. They expose how institutions work, police work, court work, prison systems. And, if we're careful, they can create empathy for the people left behind, the people who survive, and the communities that have to live with a rupture in their sense of safety. In this case, one of the most important insights is also one of the simplest. The lie didn't collapse because of a dramatic cinematic twist. It collapsed because of small inconsistencies and practical reality. A staged robbery has to answer basic questions. How did someone get in? Why did they take some things and not others? Why disable the alarm? Why leave valuables? Why does the timeline feel forced? And then on top of that, someone buys a motorcycle with cash at exactly the wrong moment. That's the thread. In many cases, criminals imagine law enforcement as either incompetent or all-seeing. In reality, investigations are often something more human, a group of people following the places where a story doesn't fit, pulling gently then harder until the seam tears. When Christian confessed, the case moved rapidly to arrests and confessions, and the public narrative flipped from unknown intruders to the daughter was involved. And once that happened, everything about Suzanne's earlier public image, her grief, her interviews, her role as a surviving child, was reinterpreted through suspicion. That's one of the darkest psychological elements in this case. Not just that the crime happened, but that it was performed afterward. The role of grieving daughter, played out while investigators looked at the staging and questioned whether the grief was real. Now, I want to be careful here. It's not our job to diagnose someone from afar, but it is our job to name patterns that courts and investigators often recognize: manipulation, strategic presentation, the use of social expectations as camouflage. A young woman from a wealthy family is not who people instinctively picture as the architect of a home invasion-style double murder. That bias about gender, class, and appearance can be exploited. And in a sense, it's another layer of what makes this case continue to disturb people. It forces society to admit that violence doesn't always come from the place we expect. But the most haunting part of this story may not be the disguise. It may be the reason it felt necessary at all. Because at its core, the problem Suzanne faced wasn't survival. It wasn't poverty. It wasn't immediate danger, based on the information in the case brief. It was conflict. It was restriction. It was a refusal. It was a blocked path to a life she wanted. And that's why people keep returning to the same question. How do you get from, I'm not getting what I want, to, I'm willing to destroy my family to get it? Some people answer with money. Some answer with passion. Some answer with entitlement. Some answer with the influence of Daniel and Christian. But the most honest answer may be that it's a convergence, an escalation spiral where each reinforcement makes the next step easier. A forbidden relationship becomes us against them. A refusal becomes, they're controlling me. A desire for independence becomes, I need to escape. And then once someone says the unsayable idea out loud, once the thought becomes a plan, the moral barrier can break faster than anyone wants to believe. And that's where we return to the victims one more time. Manfred and Marísia were not symbols. They were two people who likely believed they were doing something many parents do, drawing a boundary around their child's life, trying to steer her away from what they saw as risk. They didn't expect that boundary to become a death sentence. This case is also a reminder of how fragile normal is. A family can look intact right up until it isn't. A neighborhood can feel safe until it becomes a headline. And yet, it's equally important not to turn this into paranoia. Most family conflicts do not end in violence. Most teenagers resent their parents at some point. Most relationships that parents dislike do not become fatal. So what do we do with a story like this? We learn what we can about warning signs without pretending we can predict the unpredictable. We learn about the importance of taking threats seriously. We learn about how money and secrecy can distort relationships. And we learn how critical it is for investigators to trust evidence over appearances. If you take anything from this case, let it be this. The truth is often hidden behind the version of the story we most want to believe. The nice family, the good daughter, the random robbery. Those narratives are comforting because they keep danger outside the home. But sometimes danger is already inside. As we close, I want to center the people who can't speak for themselves, Manfred and Marísia. They were killed in their own home, and the story of their deaths has been retold for decades. The least we can do in the retelling is keep it respectful, factual, and grounded in reality. And I want to acknowledge Andreas again. Surviving a crime like this isn't just surviving a moment. It's surviving the years afterward, inheritance disputes, media attention, public pity, public anger, and the loneliness of being the person left to carry the family name when the family itself is gone. If you appreciate this style of careful, victim-centered long-form reporting, consider subscribing here at the end. And if you want a related case that explores a different kind of intimate betrayal and media spectacle, I can cover another high-profile Brazilian case next, one where public perception and legal reality collide in a completely different way. Until then, thank you for staying with this story and for treating the victims at the center of it as human beings, not just a headline.